He built an empire out of nothing but fear and good bookkeeping. Then a car bomb took his legs and left him a mafia boss who couldn't stand, couldn't trust, and had personally fired 11 nurses in 8 months. 0 exceptions. Then came a woman who couldn't even keep her own car running. She was loud. She was 22 minutes late. She broke his favorite glass in the first 90 seconds. But she was the only person in 8 months who looked at him and didn't see a man in a chair. She saw a man. Period. The Honda Civic died at the gate, not stalled, dead. Right there on the gravel drive off Sheridan Road, engine ticking out its last breath 12 feet from a pair of wrought iron gates that belonged to another century entirely. The horn gave one final, humiliating bleat before falling silent, and the sound vanished into a wall of 200-year-old oaks that had never in their long lives heard anything so undignified. Lila June Harlan sat behind the wheel for exactly 4 seconds, closed her eyes, and told herself this was fine. It was not fine. $11 in her checking account, an eviction notice folded into quarters in her glove compartment, a nursing license that had gotten her exactly 1 callback in 6 weeks. This one, from a number with no name attached, offering triple the going rate for private care, discretion required. She didn't yet know the man behind that number was a mafia boss who hadn't let a stranger this close to him in 8 months. She got out anyway. Scrubs stained at the collar, denim jacket 2 sizes too big, combat boots that had walked her out of 3 jobs that hadn't deserved her and were about to walk her into one that would. 2 men in suits that cost more than her car stood at the gate, holsters visible, watching her the way men watch something they expect to break. "I'm here about the nursing position," Lila called out, chin up, voice steadier than her stomach. "If either of you is the one I'm supposed to be examining, I'm walking back to the highway right now." Neither man smiled, but the gate opened. She walked the long drive alone, gravel crunching under boots that suddenly felt too loud. The estate rose up ahead of her the way a held breath rises, limestone and iron, Georgian in its bones, less a home than a rumor with a mailing address. Inside, the air changed. Cedar, old cigar smoke, a cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The study door was already open. A man sat with his back to her, a wheelchair beneath him instead of legs he could trust. He didn't turn around. "You're 22 minutes late," he said, voice low and rough. "And you breathe too loud." Lila set her bag down hard enough that the thud filled the room. The chair turned. Damien Alessandro Rossi looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay. Broad through the shoulders, arms roped with the kind of muscle grief builds when it's disguised as discipline. A scar through one eyebrow, a black tattoo curling from his collar toward his ear. Steel gray eyes that had already decided not to be impressed. His hand shook, a small betrayal of nerves that no longer answered to him, and the crystal glass of whiskey slipped and shattered on the hardwood. Lila didn't flinch, didn't rush to apologize on his behalf. "You'll want to fix that rug situation," she said, nodding at the hazard glistening near his wheels. "Wet floor, slick rug, somebody's hip is going to break." She stepped over the glass, crouched, and pulled the wool blanket off his lap. He caught her wrist, hard, a flash of the old reflex to control the room. She held still, met his eyes without backing away, and after a beat, his grip loosened on its own, surprised by his own force. She looked at what he'd been hiding, wasted muscle, pressure sores no one had dressed properly, the body of a man left to manage alone in a room kept cold enough to punish him. "If I'm going to work for you," she said, not unkindly, "I need to see what I'm actually working with, not what's buried under a blanket in a room that's 68 degrees. Something in his face cracked. 8 months and no one had touched the truth of his body without flinching or performing pity. Damien's grip on her wrist wasn't cruelty, it was panic wearing the mask of authority. A man who has spent his whole life equating control with survival will grab before he thinks, because the alternative is admitting he can't stop what's coming. What Lila offered him in that moment wasn't sympathy, which he would have rejected instantly, but something rarer, a witness who refused to look away and also refused to pity him. That combination, seen but not diminished, is exactly what he didn't know he was starving for. "You're hired," he said, voice gone strangely soft. Lila walked into the hallway afterward and let her back hit the cold wall, breathing like she'd run somewhere. She had no idea that in the drawer of that desk there was already a file on her, 2 weeks old, her name, her history, her brother's debts, assembled long before she'd ever driven up that road. She thought she'd just gotten a job. She had no idea she'd walked into something that had already chosen her. The weeks that followed found a rhythm neither of them admitted to enjoying. And then, one storm-heavy night, it broke. Lightning lit the estate in flashes. Beneath the covers, Damien's body convulsed, an aftershock from the spinal injury, nerves firing without his permission. Lila was up before she was fully awake. Crossing from the armchair she slept in more nights than not, climbing onto the bed, using her weight to hold his legs still. "Stop," he ground out. "Breathe, Damien, I'm here." It passed the way these things did, leaving him hollow, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time, he told her about the parking garage near South Wabash Avenue. 2 pounds of C4, wired under a car that wasn't even his. "I thought I was dead," he said. "Now I just don't want anyone to see me weak." Lila got up for his medication. Her fingers caught a thin folder wedged behind the pill bottles in a drawer whose lock had been broken for weeks. One more small thing a Mafia boss who trusted no one hadn't gotten around to fixing. She opened it before she thought better of it. Inside, a surveillance report. On her. Photographs of her handing cash to her brother outside a bar in Bridgeport, the same brother who owed money to people who didn't forgive kindly. At the bottom, in Damien's own hand, "Loyalty despite chaos. Exactly what I need." She closed the folder, heart slamming. He'd known everything about her before she ever walked through that gate. "Close the drawer, Lila," Damien said from the bed. "That's my business." "I don't love being a file in someone's desk," she said flatly. "But I'll let it go, for now." Lila's anger cools faster than it should, and that's not weakness, it's calculation. Growing up covering for a brother who kept making the same mistake taught her to separate a person's control issues from their character, because if she hadn't, she'd have walked away from her whole family years ago. She isn't excusing what Damien did. She's deciding, in real time, whether the man who investigated her is the same man who let her see his ruined legs. And some part of her already suspects those two men can't be separated. She did close it. But something had shifted. He hadn't hired her by chance. He'd chosen her, deliberately, before she'd ever chosen him. The next morning, a closed-door meeting convened at a restaurant on Taylor Street in Little Italy. Vincent Crowe stood at the head of the table, heavy through the shoulders, a scar cutting one cheek, eyes doing math they shouldn't have been doing. For months, he'd been quietly working the room, one favor and one grievance at a time, waiting for the day this particular Mafia boss's grip finally slipped enough for the family to look elsewhere. A nurse who made him laugh, who made him look strong again in front of the men. That was the one thing Vincent hadn't planned for. "A man who can't stand," Vincent said, loud enough for the table, "isn't a man who can lead." Lila had been brought in under the pretense of tending Damien's legs. She stood instead. "Are you a doctor?" she said, pointing at Vincent. "A neurologist? Because unless you are, I'd shut up about Mr. Rossi's condition." "He survived 2 pounds of C4. He runs this operation from the neck up, which is more than I can say for you." The room went silent. Someone near the back choked down a laugh. Damien set a hand on her shoulder, a rare public gesture. Vincent's eyes settled on Lila with new calculation. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was becoming either Damien's weakness or the reason his grip was tightening again, right when Vincent needed it loose. Across the room, unnoticed by either of them, one of the household staff glanced down at a phone under the table and typed a short message before slipping it back into his pocket. Something was already moving that neither of them could see yet. Damien kept a full surveillance file on Lila before she ever walked through his gate, and never told her the whole truth about it. Team Lila. She deserved to know everything from day one. Team Damien. Some truths only get earned. Drop your team in the comments before next part. That evening, Damien wore a charcoal three-piece suit, blanket over his lap, seated at RPM Steak on Kinsey Street. Security had swept the block an hour earlier. In the SUV beforehand, Lila sat across from him, adjusting his collar out of habit more than necessity. The engine idled low, heater ticking, rain starting to bead on the windshield in fat, unhurried drops. "You don't have to come tonight," Damien said, watching her fingers work the fabric instead of his face. "It's business. It'll bore you." "You said that about the accountant meeting. I found out you're funding a scholarship for kids in Bridgeport under a shell name nobody's supposed to know about." She smoothed the last wrinkle out of his lapel and finally met his eyes. "You're not as boring as you think you are, Mr. Rossi." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, there and gone before it could be caught and used against him. He'd built Rossi Logistics out of his father's debts and his uncle's mistakes, clawed the family out of 2 decades of small-time extortion and into something that could survive an audit. Nobody outside this car knew that part of him. He wasn't sure why he'd let her see it. "Your brother called the house line again," he said instead, changing the subject the way he always did when something got too close. "Marcus flagged it. Danny's 3 weeks behind on the VIG now, not 2. Lila's jaw tightened. "I told him not to call here." "I told Marcus to send the money anyway." "Damien, it's already done." His voice left no room for the argument she was gearing up to have. "Don't thank me. I didn't do it for gratitude." She studied him a long moment, rain ticking harder against the glass now. "Then why?" He didn't answer. He straightened his cuffs instead, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind that meant he knew exactly why, and wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Security had swept the block an hour earlier. Lila waited outside in the SUV, medical bag on her knees, the way she always did. Someone inside Vincent's circle had leaked the reservation. Gunfire cracked through the restaurant. Not one shot, but a ragged volley, glass detonating outward in a bright, falling sheet that caught the streetlight for half a second before it hit the pavement in 1,000 pieces. Somewhere, a woman was screaming and didn't stop. The smell of cordite rolled out onto the sidewalk, thick enough to taste. Damien was thrown from his chair, pinned between an overturned banquette and the sidewalk near State Street, his cheek pressed to cold concrete, one hand scrabbling uselessly for a grip his legs couldn't give him. Lila didn't think. She threw the medical bag aside and ran. 15 feet of open, bullet-torn space, the world gone narrow and roaring, her own heartbeat louder in her ears than the second round of gunfire. Knees tearing open on the concrete as she slid into the narrow gap between a planter and his overturned chair, shielding him with her body. "Lila, get down!" Damien roared, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was real fear in it, not command. She didn't listen. A piece of shrapnel from the wheelchair's armrest tore into his shoulder, and still, somehow, he twisted beneath her, using what strength he had left in his torso to angle himself between her and the open street, though he could barely move below the waist. "Are you insane?" he shouted, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. "Shut up and hold still," she shouted back, and the absurdity of it, bickering like an old married couple in the middle of a firefight, was the only thing keeping either of them from falling apart. Marcus got them out through the kitchen, past a walk-in cooler and a service door that slammed on its hinges behind them. They ended up in an old brick warehouse safe house in Bridgeport, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in a way that made everything look bruised and unreal, adrenaline draining out of both of them in shaking waves that came in long after the danger had passed. Lila stitched his shoulder with hands that trembled but didn't stop, her breath coming out in short, controlled counts. 4 in, 4 out. A trick she'd learned in an ICU years ago for exactly this, for keeping her own hands honest when her body wanted to fall apart. Damien watched her work by the buzzing light, jaw tight against the pain, and said nothing for a long time. "You're a liability," he said quietly, finally, not looking at her. "Your legs are dead," Lila answered, not looking up from the needle. "But you still covered me with your own body. You're still the strongest man I've ever met." His hand found hers on his shoulder, not to stop her, just to feel that she was real, that they'd both made it out of that street. "My father used to say a man who needs saving isn't a man at all," he said. He said it the week before a rival family put 3 bullets in him outside a barber shop on Taylor Street. I was 11. I decided that night I'd rather be alone than be that kind of fool. And now? Now I don't know what I decided anymore. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded moving under the exhaustion in his eyes. "Every rule I built my life on, you keep breaking." They kissed then, heavy, desperate, tasting of blood and antiseptic, and the particular relief of 2 people who'd expected for 1 full minute to die. The next morning, back at Lake Forest, gray light pooling through the tall windows like it was too tired to fully commit to daytime, Damien held out an envelope. His hand didn't shake this time, a small, deliberate steadiness he'd clearly had to work for. "Go," he said. "California. Don't come back." Lila tore the envelope open instead, money scattered across the desk like dead leaves drifting to the floor, and neither of them moved to catch it. From inside, a small black USB drive fell out, labeled in his handwriting, "Vincent. Proof. For Lila only if I'm gone." She picked it up. He didn't reach for it. "I prepared that before you ever tore into it," he said quietly. "Weeks ago, I told myself it was just good planning. A man in my position should always have contingencies." A pause, his throat working. "I don't think that's why I made it anymore." She gripped the drive, eyes wet, turning it over once in her fingers like she could read the truth off the plastic casing itself. He wasn't just pushing her away. He was handing her a way to protect herself and the whole empire after he was gone, in the one language he still fully trusted. Paperwork, evidence, a plan that didn't depend on anyone's mercy. "You keep doing this," she said, voice cracking, "protecting me and shoving me out the door in the same breath." "I don't know how to do one without the other," he admitted. "Nobody ever taught me." She didn't play it. Not yet. Some truths, she understood, weren't meant to be opened alone. Instead, she set the drive on the desk between them, deliberately, like a promise neither of them had said out loud yet, and gathered the scattered bills off the floor without a word, not accepting them, not refusing them, just refusing to leave. Outside in the hallway, unseen by either of them, a member of the household staff paused a half-second too long outside the study door before continuing on his rounds. The same man who, 2 nights later, would be gone from the property before anyone thought to ask him a single question. 3 nights passed in a strange, careful quiet. Damien's shoulder healed slower than he let on. Lila caught him twice in the hallway mirror, testing the grip strength in that arm when he thought no one was watching, jaw set the same stubborn way it had been the first day she met him. On the 3rd night, she found him at the window instead of asleep, the Lake Forest grounds spread out dark and silver under a thin moon. "You should be resting," she said. "I keep thinking about the guard rotation," he said, not turning. Marcus changed the codes twice this week. He hasn't told me why.
Maybe he's just careful.
Marcus is always careful. This is different. He rubbed at the scar through his eyebrow, an old habit she'd started to recognize as worry wearing a smaller face. Something's coming. I can feel it, the way you feel weather in a bad knee. She sat on the arm of his chair, close enough that her shoulder pressed his.
Then we'll feel it together.
He almost smiled at that. Almost. At 2 a.m, the security feed at the Lake Forest estate went dark. Damien slept heavily, dosed on pain medication after the shooting. Lila sat in the armchair, reading by a small lamp, the house around them creaking the way old houses do in the deep hours, settling into itself. The bedroom door was kicked in, a splintering crack of wood that swallowed whatever quiet had come before it. 2 men in tactical gear stormed through, suppressors fitted, the small red dots of their sights sweeping the room in jerky and mechanical arcs. Vincent Crowe walked in behind them, gun in hand, smiling coldly. The same smile Lila remembered from the restaurant on Taylor Street, except now it had nowhere left to hide behind. Your chaotic little nurse is about to be a mafia boss's final weakness. Damien woke instantly, rolled off the bed, dropped to the floor, back against the bed frame. A motion so practiced it looked almost rehearsed, a survival reflex built over 8 months of nights just like this one. Lila grabbed his silver cane off the nightstand, knuckles white around it. One gunman lunged. Lila swung the cane into his wrist and his weapon clattered away across the hardwood. He laughed through gritted teeth, more surprised than hurt. Vincent said the Debt brother's sister makes good leverage. Guess you're tougher than we figured. Lila's stomach dropped at the word brother, ice flooding through her before the anger even caught up to it. From the floor, Damien answered, ice in his voice. Marcus moved the kid out of the city the night after the shooting on Kinsey Street. You're 2 weeks too slow. Lila's breath caught. Vincent had planned to use her brother as leverage. But Damien had protected him the moment real danger became undeniable, without ever telling her, quietly, the same way he'd quietly paid off the VIG, the same way he did everything that actually mattered to him. Damien fired twice from the floor, the recoil jarring up through a body that could no longer brace against it, his teeth gritted against the pain in his shoulder. One man dropped, hit in the thigh, screaming into the floorboards. The second turned toward Lila, sight settling. Damien didn't hesitate. He fired once, precisely, and the man went down before he could pull the trigger, the suppressed shot barely louder than a cough in the ringing silence that followed. For 8 months, Damien's greatest fear wasn't dying. It was needing someone and having them see it as proof he'd stopped being useful. But watching a gun swing toward Lila strips that fear down to nothing in half a second, because it turns out his deepest terror was never his own weakness. It was being the reason someone he loved got hurt. That single, clean shot from the floor is the first time all night he acts like a man protecting his family instead of a man protecting his pride. He hit a switch on his phone. The new titanium-framed wheelchair surged forward across the room and slammed into Vincent's knee with a sound like a car door closing hard. Vincent's leg buckled, and he went down screaming, the chair grinding to a stop against the floorboards, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the sudden quiet. "Power was never in the legs, Vince," Damien said, eyes cold, breathing hard from the floor where he still sat. "It was always in the mind, and yours has always been weak." Marcus and the crew flooded in from the hallway, boots pounding, flashlights cutting white across the wrecked room. Vincent was dragged out, still shouting threats that got smaller and less certain with every step toward the door. "How did they get past the gate?" Lila asked, shaking, the cane still gripped in both hands like she hadn't quite registered the fight was over. Marcus's jaw tightened. "A night shift guard. Vincent had him on payroll for weeks. He's already gone. We'll find him." Lila thought, distantly, of the man who'd lingered too long outside the study door 3 nights ago and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that she didn't yet have words for. When the room finally emptied, Damien looked at Lila with an expression stripped of every layer of pride he'd worn for years, no armor left in it at all. "I wasn't just protecting you," he said, voice hoarse. "I made sure you'd never have to choose between me and your family." She sank down onto the floor beside him, both of them too tired and too wrung out to move to the bed, and just breathed there together in the wreckage, her hand finding his in the dark. Gray dawn crept over Lake Forest, the kind of pale, early light that makes everything look like it's still deciding whether the night is really over. The room had been cleaned, the broken door already replaced, as if the house itself were trying to forget. Damien sat by the window in his chair, staring out at the distant gray line of Lake Michigan. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her hands finally still, the adrenaline long since burned out and replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion neither of them mentioned. "You've been quiet," she said. "I'm always quiet the morning after," he said. "It's when I count what I almost lost." She almost asked him to list it. She didn't need to. Then his body betrayed him again. Autonomic dysreflexia, a dangerous spike in blood pressure that can hit spinal injury patients like him without warning, especially after hours of physical strain the body hadn't fully recovered from. His face flushed dark red, a headache slamming behind his eyes hard enough to make him grip the armrest, his breath coming short and shallow. "Something's wrong," he managed. Lila was moving before he finished the sentence, the same clean, practiced speed she'd used stitching his shoulder 2 nights before. She knew instantly what it likely was. Hours pinned on the floor during the fight, a kinked catheter line, his body screaming a warning through the only channel it had left to scream through. "Don't let me die," he said, gripping her hand, his voice stripped down to something small she'd never heard from him before. "Not before I tell you the truth." "You are not allowed to die," she said, elevating his head, checking and clearing the line with hands that didn't shake, even though her voice did, monitoring his pressure, watching him with the focus of someone who had done this 100 times and would not lose him now. "I already saved you once. I'm not doing it twice. Breathe with me. Count it out. 4 in." He counted with her, ragged at first, then steadier, his eyes locked on hers like she was the only fixed point left in the room. The episode passed after 15 long minutes that felt considerably longer to both of them. Damien settled back against the chair, color returning slowly to his face, looking at her like he was seeing something for the first time. Not the nurse who'd walked up his driveway 6 weeks ago, but something he hadn't let himself name yet. "No more hourly wage," he said, voice hoarse, rough at the edges. "I'm offering you the whole empire, as an equal partner." Lila didn't answer right away. Her hand drifted to her jacket pocket where the USB still sat, small and heavy against her palm. He'd handed her proof. He'd handed her power. But the truth on that drive still hadn't been spoken aloud. And she realized, suddenly, sitting there in the thin morning light with his pulse finally steady under her fingers, that she didn't want to hear it alone. "Play it with me," she said. "Whatever's on there. I want you next to me when I hear it." Late morning light filled the living room. Damien and Lila sat together, the wheelchair parked beside the sofa. Lila set the small black drive on the table between them. Damien reached over and pressed play himself. It was an old recording, pulled, he explained, from a wire Marcus had planted in Vincent's car months earlier. Vincent's voice, bragging to a lieutenant, unmistakable. He was the one who'd planted the bomb in the garage off South Wabash Avenue. "I've suspected him for 8 months, Damien said quietly. "I've had this for 6. But suspicion isn't enough to move against a made man. Not without proof strong enough to keep the rest of the family from tearing itself apart over it. I was waiting for the day I could end this clean. I just didn't expect that day to also be the day I found you." Damien's 6-month silence wasn't cowardice. It was the discipline of a man who understood that one wrong move could start a war with no winners. His real conflict was never whether to act, but whether he was still capable of building something worth protecting once the fighting was over. Lila didn't just give him a reason to finally move against Vincent. She gave him a future worth surviving for, which is the one thing 8 months of quiet vengeance alone had never offered him. Lila's hands shook. "You needed proof, and you needed me, and you got both at the same time." He drew a second envelope from beside him, the one he'd meant to give her from the start. Inside, a notarized contract transferring 15% ownership of a legitimate logistics company into her name. "I signed this the week you stood in that restaurant and told Vincent to shut up about my legs," he said. "I didn't know yet what I'd do with Vincent. I already knew what I wanted to do about you." Tears rose in her eyes. "You believed in me before I believed you were worth staying for." He drew her gently onto his lap, his upper body still strong enough to hold her steady. "Now we rule together, not with blood, with whatever's left of us that's still worth building on." They kissed slowly in the morning light, the wheelchair standing quiet beside them. Damien murmured against her hair. "I used to think losing my legs meant losing everything, until a chaotic nurse walked in and proved that sometimes the strongest thing a mafia boss can do is let go of the old power, to build something new with the one person who saw him when he couldn't see himself anymore." Across town, in a room no one was watching closely enough, a phone that had belonged to a bribed guard buzzed once with a message no one would read until it was too late to matter. But Damien and Lila didn't know that yet. All they knew, standing in that quiet room, was that from this day forward, they were no longer alone. This story reminds us that strength was never about standing without help. It was about letting someone see you sitting down and choosing to stay anyway. If you've buried a husband, a wife, 30 years of a marriage, or a career that used to tell you who you were, here's something more useful than "stay strong." Call one person this week, not a text, an actual phone call, and let them hear how you're really doing, even if the honest answer is, "not great." If your knees or your hips have started setting the rules for your day, let someone carry the grocery bag without arguing about it. Accepting one small hand today keeps you steady enough to offer your own hand tomorrow. And if pride has kept you eating dinner alone, rather than admit the house is too quiet, join the Tuesday coffee group at your community center or church. Not for inspiration, just because a full table is good medicine. Damien didn't heal by standing again. He healed by finally letting one honest person see him when he couldn't stand at all. That's still available to you, wherever you are today. What did you think of Lila's transformation? From an overlooked nurse to a woman who stood as an equal beside a mafia boss who once thought strength lived only in his legs? Tell us in the comments. If this story moved you, like it, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more.